This screencast is on the tools of fiscal policy. So when we're talking about fiscal policy, you need to know what the two tools of fiscal policy are. You need to know when to use the two tools of fiscal policy, and then also what impact they have on the leading economic indicators. Fiscal policy, which is also known as discretionary fiscal policy, are changes in government spending and taxation in order to stabilize the economy. So when we talk about those leading economic indicators, we're talking about employment so that we can achieve full employment, and we're talking about inflation where we're trying to stabilize the prices. So first we can look here at the recessionary gap. And as we've talked about, the recessionary gap is when you're not at full employment output, you're below it. And so what needs to happen here is the government needs to stimulate the economy. And if you were thinking again about the business cycle, this is when GDP is going down and unemployment is going up. And so the goal of this expansionary fiscal policy is to stop unemployment. So with expansionary fiscal policy, you have two choices in how to do this. One of them is to increase government spending. Think about the AD curve here. For the aggregate demand, it's C plus I plus G plus XN. So it's that G that we're manipulating. And when you increase the government spending, you're increasing the aggregate demand curve. So with this one, when we're looking at how much the aggregate demand curve will increase or shift to the right, we need to think about the multiplier. If the government were to spend $100 and the MPC was 0.8, how much additional GDP or real GDP would be created? Remember, the formula for that is the change in the autonomous aggregate spending times 1 over the MPS. This would turn out to be 5, and so $500 would be created through the government spending 100. If we were to see how that would impact the ADAS model, you would see that the AD curve would shift out here to the right, and there we're looking at it with government spending. Now, the other option that the government has is instead of spending, the government could decrease taxes. When we think about the AD here, the C plus I plus G plus XN, we're looking at consumption. And so the problem, though, with decreasing taxes, remember, is that people have two choices when they have a change in their disposable income. They can either spend it or they can save it. And with decreasing taxes, it's not a guarantee that people are going to spend all of their money. And so when we look here again, if the government was to decrease taxes by $100 and the MPC is 0.8, we would look here and see how much money would be created from this decrease in taxes. The formula that you have here is that change in autonomous aggregate spending, which is decreasing taxes by $100, and you have the formula for the tax multiplier of a negative MPC divided by the MPS. And so the $100 times 4 would cause GDP to increase by $400. So remember that an increase in government spending, all of it gets put in there and multiplied through. A decrease in taxes, you're not able to impact the aggregate demand as much with that tax multiplier. And so if you were to look at how that would shift the aggregate demand curve, you would see that it's not going to shift it as much as the government spending. So when there is a recessionary gap, you use expansionary fiscal policy. Your choices are to increase government spending and or decrease taxes. And the goal here is to stop unemployment. The other option here that we have with fiscal policy is when there's an inflationary gap. And in this case here with the inflationary gap, remember that the output is beyond the full employment output. When we think about what's going on with the business cycle, this is where we have the upward sloping part of the business cycle, that expansionary or recovery phase. And in this case here, what we're really worried about is inflation. So the goal of contractionary fiscal policy is to combat inflation. And you have two ways of doing that. The first way with contractionary fiscal policy is to decrease government spending. And when we think about that AD curve, again, the G would be manipulated here, and that would shift the AD curve to the left. How much? We use that multiplier. In this case here, if we had government spending going down by $50 and still an MPC of 0.8, when we look at how real GDP would change, we would see here that negative $50 times 1 over the MPS, that's going to have a decrease in real GDP by $250. So if we were to put that on the graph, you would have an AD curve that would shift that much. So that one is the government spending multiplier, which the other way that would equally shift it, remember, is this one could have been like investment spending is the multiplier. That's also that formula. But with fiscal policy, we're only dealing with government spending and taxation. So if they want to have the contractionary fiscal policy, instead of decreasing government spending, they could increase taxes. And so if they were to increase taxes by $50 and you had that MPC of 0.8, you would have a change in real GDP here with the tax multiplier of negative MPC divided by MPS. That would have it with it at a negative 200. And so with that, you can see here that the decrease in the aggregate demand curve is only going to be going down with the $200 instead of the $250. So you're not going to see as drastic of a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Again, we use contractionary fiscal policy when there is an inflationary gap. The way to utilize contractionary fiscal policy is to decrease government spending or to increase taxes, and you're doing that to combat inflation.